I'm Becky from Care for the Family, and today in this episode of Talking Faith, I'm joined by Kara Powell from the Fuller Youth Institute. Hi, Kara.
Hey, Becky, it's great to be with you today.
We're really excited to have you with us. So just before we start, can you tell us a little bit about you, what you do, and what your family looks like?
Yeah, I'll start with my family. My husband is actually 100% Welsh. So his parents were from Cardiff and immigrated to the US before my husband was even born. So I have a special affinity for Wales, and we've been there. It's such a lovely country. And we have 3 kids who are 22, 20, and 16. And our 20-year-old is just wrapping up a semester in London. So this I feel very connected to the UK right now. And I'm happy to be here in this conversation. And then in terms of my ministry role, I'm a faculty member at Fuller Seminary, but really my 2 primary roles at Fuller are I'm the Chief of Leadership Formation, and then I'm also the Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute. And it's probably that latter hat that I'll mostly be wearing in this conversation. So our mission at the Fuller Youth Institute is to equip diverse leaders and parents so faithful young people can change our world. And we do that by turning research into resources. So I love research, but I love it even more when we can translate research into a practical idea for leaders, parents, step-parents, grandparents.
That's amazing. That sounds so good. And you're right. We want to talk to you a little bit about your work as part of the Fuller Youth Institute. And when we first started the Kitchen Table Project, we actually looked at your book, Sticky Faith, and we found that really helpful in informing the resources we put together and as we were building the project. So that's awesome. Could you maybe give us a brief overview of what you find is key for parents to help their children grow in faith?
Yeah. Well, gosh, hopefully that'll be the themes for this whole conversation. But what comes to mind first when you ask that question, Becky, is something very personal to me. And that is that as important as parents are in a young person's life, and honestly, it's hard to point to any influence more important in a young person's faith than parents, step-parents, guardians, whoever's raising the child or children. As important as parents are, I think some of our most interesting research has been about the power of intergenerational relationships. We looked at 13 different youth group participation variables, 13 things, and this was a US study, 13 things that youth groups tend to do in the context of youth ministry. And, to our delight, studying scripture was correlated with mature faith. Being involved in service and justice was correlated with mature faith. But of everything we looked at, the one that was most correlated with mature faith was intergenerational worship and relationships. So, so often the young people are kind of on their own, in their own room, in the church, doing their own programs, et cetera. And what our research shows is how important it is for young people to have not just parents investing in them, but we usually say five adults. But really, 1 adult, 3 adult, any number of adults who are investing in them, mentoring them, being that safety net for them as they're making choices of their own. So of all of our sticky faith research, that's usually what stands out the most to families.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a big challenge, I think, for us as parents, but also for the church and the way that we do things. Have you found that with in using that research?
Yeah, and I would say, at least in the US, it's even more challenging in the pandemic. So let me get even more personal here. We have 3 kids. Our youngest is 16. She's in 11th grade. So she has a year and a half in the US school system before she'll presumably go to college. And she's had an amazing small group leader for the last 4 years. Their small group met at our house once a week. And this young woman who was investing in Jessica, we were so pleased. Well, during the pandemic, Sam moved. A lot of young adults, especially in cities that are expensive to live in, like Los Angeles is, moved during the pandemic. And so Jessica really lost the primary mentor who was investing in her. And so my husband and I, we looked at each other, we prayed, and we thought, okay, we've got a year and a half to, recreate a team of adults around Jessica. So I've reached out to some moms who also have 11th grade girls in my daughter's grade. And it looks like we're going to start some kind of mothers and daughter group Because as I've told some of the moms, like, I want my daughter to be around you. You are an amazing Jesus follower, and I want my daughter to be around you. So I would say it's always challenging to create intergenerational relationships. You know, the generations tend to kind of keep to themselves. Older people are intimidated by teenagers, et cetera. But it's still so important. And I think we have to be a little bit more creative. I will say, for those who have younger kids, like in elementary age, part of what we would do when our kids were younger is we'd ask them what adults they wanted to get to know better. And if any of those folks were babysitters, then those became our go-to babysitters. And so, let me just say, when it comes to this team of adults, we don't need to keep it a secret from our kids. In fact, we should be talking to our kids about it. What adults are on your team? Who would you talk to about, fill in the blank, something tough that you might go through? And, as we get that information, we as parents and guardians, we can be a little bit more intentional in how do we keep our kids crossing paths with those adults that they already feel some kind of spark toward.
That's really, really helpful. Really, really good. Just thinking, I've got two boys who are 10 and 12.
Okay.
And just thinking about the people who we would want to influence them.
Yeah.
And I love the onus that is on you as a parent to seek out those people as well. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah. And what was interesting in our Sticky Faith research, one of our major studies was we studied high school graduates for their first three years in college. And it was often when these students, especially as college students, would talk about adults who were meaningful to them, it was often, my mom's friend who they go walking with every morning, or the mentor that my dad has coffee with. He's the one who's reaching out to me and asking how he can be praying for me. So, we can of course ask our kids who they would like to get to know better, but then we can look in our own friendship circles and think, gosh, as I'm doing now with these moms, like, which of these Jesus following adults do I want my kid to be around more?
Yeah, that's awesome. What a challenge for us as parents to think about. It's great. So I was thinking, Sticky Faith was written about 10 years ago, I think.
2011, the first book came out.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think anything's changed in that time? Like, is there anything that parents have had to adapt to?
Yeah, the two big things that come to mind are technology and mental health challenges. So, of course, and the two are actually correlated. We had cell phones in 2011, but they weren't nearly as common as they are now. They weren't such a part, especially of our kids' lives. But I'm actually probably more concerned, and I would more want families to know about mental health challenges. And I don't have data for the UK, but I will say here in the US, during the last 2 years of the pandemic, anxiety has tripled, depression has quadrupled. I don't know any family with teenage girls that's not dealing with anxiety, stress, depression. The rates for boys are a tiny bit lower, but still astonishingly high. And so yeah, that's something else that we need to keep an eye out for in our family. And we have some tools actually at the Full Youth Institute that folks can access on our website. A free podcast series that's fantastic, geared for parents. I've listened to it 3 times myself, and as well as just some helpful questions that we can ask our kids about.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's definitely a similar situation in the UK. I know we've been talking about mental health quite a lot recently, and the levels of anxiety in our kids, especially coming out of the pandemic, I think absolutely we're seeing definitely similar patterns. So it's definitely something to be thinking about. And so you've recently written a new book called 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager.
Yes.
So what made you start thinking about that book particularly?
Well, it was largely conviction that we were not understanding the big questions that young people wrestle with. During the process of our study, we came across a 15-year-old who said, "I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking. I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking." And, I think the same honestly can be said of our families. Like, are we really in the strike zone? Are we really in the bullseye? Strike zone is a baseball term, so I don't know. That's very
okay. Yeah, we can figure that out.
I don't know what the cricket counterpart would be, but are we really in the bullseye of what young people need? And so we did over 2,000 interviews and focus groups, and then did deep dive multi-hour sessions with 27 diverse teenagers in the US. And we were able to identify teenagers' three big questions of identity, who am I, belonging, where do I fit, and purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. Now, these are questions that all of us deal with, not just those under 30. But I would say for those of us over 30, these questions are usually at a low simmer, where for those of us under 30, the questions are at a rolling boil. And, you know, I will say in my own life, if I have heat about an issue, if I'm struggling with an issue, it's so interesting how often it's related to identity, belonging, or purpose. Something is being threatened in my sense of identity, belonging, or purpose. So with our own kids, like if our kids are ever doing something that just feels a little askew, a little bit not like them, if I and my husband, we take a step back and ask, okay, you know, is our kid looking for identity? Are they looking for belonging? Are they looking for purpose? Normally, it's like I totally come to understand what they're doing now. That thing that didn't make sense, that attitude, those actions that didn't make sense, they actually make a whole lot more sense if I think about it as part of our kids' quest for identity, belonging, or purpose. So these three questions have just really become the glasses through which I'm viewing myself and young people.
Wow, that's really interesting. So it's like a framework that you're looking at them using to question their behavior, I guess, and
and really understand. So like, let me give a practical example. One of our kids, our youngest, was on the volleyball team at her school, and they were going to pick captains. And again, she's in 11th grade, so she's not the oldest grade, the second oldest. And normally captains are seniors, but there was only one senior, one 12th grader who would really be logical as a captain. And they usually pick two captains. So our daughter was wondering, like, am I going to be the second captain? And for like 2 weeks, she was talking about this every day when she came home from practice, like talking about it a surprising amount of time. And finally, as I took a step back and asked, okay, what is going on from the perspective of identity, belonging, and purpose, I realized that a lot of this was about her sense of purpose and how she was going to influence the other girls on the team. And she felt like she could influence them more if she was captain. And while that's true, when I realized that's what was in Jessica's mind, I started to talk to her about, well, you know, how can you be an influencer even if you're not a captain? How can you be an influencer even if you're on the bench? Like, how can you be a positive team member and a leader even if you're not designated captain, just to kind of help her reframe it. So that was an example of my daughter just being kind of riveted on something, and I couldn't figure out why until I stopped and said, wait, is she after identity? Is she after belonging? Or is she after purpose? So it's just a lens that helps me better understand and empathize with, again, myself, my friends, and young people.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I guess if you hadn't had that framework, then she would be coming to you, and as parents, our natural instinct is to jump in and try and fix the situation.
Or to tell her it's no big deal, like you'll be captain next year. But it just gives me empathy. And you know, Becky, I'm more and more convinced that good leadership starts with empathy, good marriage starts with empathy, good parenting starts with empathy, with us really understanding our kids. And listening to our kids. You know, just a couple weeks ago, our 20-year-old said to me, like, I don't feel like you're listening to me. And she was right. I wasn't. And so like those words really haunt me. And so I apologized. In fact, I apologized, and then I was gone for 48 hours. And I felt convicted I needed to apologize even further. So when I got back, I like left my luggage by the front door, went into her room and apologized again. And we had this great 45-minute conversation about what I do that feels like listening and what I do that feels like not listening. And so, yeah, our kids want to know that we're listening, that we get them. And so me thinking about my kids through the lens of identity, belonging, and purpose helps me do that. I'm still very flawed, as I just shared a story of my own struggles as a parent. I'm still very flawed, but it at least gives me a tool in my toolkit.
Yeah, I don't think all of us feel like that as parents at times. We definitely haven't got it figured out at all.
Yeah.
But
And let me just say, one of the themes in our research is how powerful it is when we as parents apologize to our kids.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's never too early to start apologizing to our kids for our tone of voice, for our impatience. And in fact, we used to, when our kids were younger, in elementary age, we used to ask around the dinner table, like, what mistake did you make today? Because we wanted to be able to talk really honestly about our mistakes. And it's hilarious. Our youngest at the time, she would have a list of mistakes that I had made during the day. Well, you overfilled the soap dispenser and you didn't see that one car when we were driving. She would totally track my mistakes, but that's okay. I wanted us to be able to talk about our mistakes and, if need be, ask forgiveness from each other, which sometimes happened around the dinner table and hopefully will just continue to happen. So
yeah, that's great. Inviting feedback on your own parenting.
Yeah.
Just going back to that understanding and listening to your kids, it can be hard, isn't it, when our children's view is so far removed from our own, and when we think completely differently.
Totally.
And their questions can be really challenging. And to be honest, we don't even understand the culture they're living in particularly well, because it's changed so much. So how can we as Christian parents navigate that well? Have you got any practical suggestions?
Yeah, super practical suggestions, actually, things that I say myself as a parent. So first, I would say, and especially, when your kid is, say, 13 and older, some of the questions that we love asking our kids are, what do you no longer believe that you think I still do believe? And what do you now believe that you think I no longer believe? In other words, we want to acknowledge that our kids' faith and worldview is changing, and it's going to be different than ours in some areas. And so instead of that being a secret or a taboo topic, we want to be able to talk about that. And so, what do you no longer believe that you think I still believe? And what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? And we ask those questions and kind of hold our breath. And half the time our kids are like, nothing's really changed. But the other half of the time there is something that's changed. And I would sure rather know about that. Generally, it's our kids being more progressive on cultural issues than we are, which is very common in the US. I imagine it's fairly common in the UK also. And I would far rather be able to talk about that than not talk about it. So those two questions have been huge. And then, I will say this, that I have a PhD in practical theology. I've gone to 26 grades of school, and my kids at about age 11 could stump me with their questions about God. So there's no way that we can respond to every question about God or life. And, I like to say, I actually take comfort in us not fully being able to explain God, because if we could explain God, then God wouldn't really be God. God would be like a cool person. So I take comfort in not being able to explain God, but nonetheless, in that moment in the car or around the kitchen table, or as you're tucking your kid in at night and they ask a question, it's easy to panic as a parent. And so these 4 words have been so helpful for me and for other parents. I don't know, but. I don't know, but. So if your kid asks you a tough question, boy, I don't know. But how about if you and me, let's meet with that woman at our church who's a scientist and I know loves questions about science. Or I don't know, but how about we talk with our pastor, because I know that, he's been really studying quite a bit and he might have some insight. Or, this is often what I've said, I can't fully answer that question, but here's how God has been real to me. Here's how God has taken suffering and used it for good. So I can also get more personal and autobiographical in my answer. So that 4-word phrase, I don't know, but, it sets up a next conversation with either just you or with somebody else who might have some perspective. And it also lets you share a little bit more personally. So I don't know, but I'll say this too. There's often a reason that a young person is asking the question. So if your kid asks you a question, it's often helpful to say, gosh, that's a great question. What makes you want to ask that question? Notice I didn't say why, because the term why can put people on the defense. So, boy, I'm so glad you asked. I'm curious, what makes you want to ask that question and see, what are they wrestling with? It might have something to do with identity, belonging, and purpose beneath the surface.
Okay. I guess it's being okay with uncertainty as well. So
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, because again, like if our faith could be fully explained, it wouldn't be faith. So that's no excuse for lazy thought. And at the same time, part of being a person of faith is having a certain amount of trust in what we cannot see, as Hebrews, I think it is 11:1 says. So we can take comfort in that. We can bring in other wise voices to help our family with our family's questions, and we can just continue the conversation.
Great. That's really, really good. And I was reading in the book a little bit more as well, and you talk about Jesus-centered answers. And I love that phrase, Jesus-centered answers.
Yes.
So when we do talk about these questions of identity, purpose, and belonging, how do we point to Jesus, more Jesus-centered answers? How do we do that?
Super glad you asked that, Becky. So that was a big part of this research for 3 big questions that change every teenager also was, okay, here we looked at how young people are currently answering identity, belonging, and purpose questions, and what's a better Jesus-centered answer. And we try to distill those Jesus-centered answers into a word each. So I'll give the word for each of them. When it comes to identity, so often young people don't feel like they measure up. And so our single word is enough. That Jesus makes us enough. Jesus makes us more than enough. And that's our identity. So enough. Belonging. Young people are used to a world that likes them conditionally. And so we want them to know that there's unconditional love with, that's the single word, with God's people. And of course, we can find community outside of God's people, but we want young people to know there's something unique and powerful about community with God's people, God's family. And then purpose. Purpose. Young people want to pursue what feels good to them, and et cetera. Well, we want to help them frame it as being part of God's story. Story is the word there. So that their purpose is found in living out God's story for them. So enough with story for identity, belonging, and purpose. And let me just say, I pray these 3 words for myself. And I've started praying these 3 words for my husband and our 3 kids this morning in my time with the Lord. That was a big part of how I prayed for our family, is that for each of them, that they would know that they're enough, what they're dealing with when it comes to the church, and how do they just continue to stay connected to God's people. And then especially as they're teenagers and young adults, that they would know that they're part of God's story. So yeah, these 3 words, I believe in them theologically, and they've really become the skeleton for my prayers for my kids and me and my husband. So
that's brilliant. I love that.
And let me just say, we encourage churches and families to come up with words that fit you and your young people better. So, we offer this as a springboard. You might tweak them or replace one with something that fits your tradition or what God's doing in your family, but we at least offer enough with and story as an initial springboard.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, because I thought often we don't know where to start, I think, sometimes with
Yeah.
our kids. And you start going into the teenage years, and all of a sudden there's this big change. So having those tools and that starting place, I think, is really helpful. Definitely.
Yeah, and in the book, which would be just as relevant for kids in the UK as in the US, we give over 300 questions that a parent, a mentor, a leader, a grandparent can use for conversations with kids. So it's been really interesting. In fact, we just heard from a youth pastor who he's like, I have no problem talking to other people's kids, but with my own kids, it's often tougher. And so he's using our book with his own teenager at home, more than he even needs it with the kids in his church. So you never know how God's going to use that book. So
yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things you asked as part of the research, I think, was, what does it mean to you to be a Christian?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that a lot of the answers focused on behavior.
Yeah.
But few of them mentioned relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
So what insights do you have to help parents avoid faith being all about behavior? Because that's an easy trap to fall into, isn't it? This is how we do things.
Totally. Becky, you know what? As a researcher, I'm also aware of what I wish I would have done differently as a parent. And so I've just been thinking about this last month, and it's the first time I've shared it. But if I could go back, I would talk about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus a whole lot more. We talked about Jesus, of course, and we talked about God, we talked about faith, we talked about church. I mean, we talked at every dinner about how we saw God at work. So don't get me wrong, like there was a lot of faith threads weaving their way through our family. But in the midst of that, I wish, and I offer this to parents of any age, but especially if your kids are on the younger side, like talk about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Jesus is what separates Christianity from every other religion. Jesus is what's most compelling about Christianity. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And you know, there's something about, and we see this in study after study, there's something about Jesus that is really significant to young people. And so as much as we can just talk about Jesus, I would recommend parents do that.
That's brilliant. I love that. So if you could give just one piece of advice to parents of teenagers about how to help their children grow in faith, what would it be?
Well, I'll share something I'm doing with my own teenager. And I shared it with a couple moms yesterday, and they said, oh, that's really helpful. So it comes to mind here is, you know, I think a lot of times our teenagers believe something about themselves or their life that isn't true. And they kind of know it's not true. You know, it's that high achieving teenager who's afraid he's going to fail, even though he gets all A's. It's that teenager who doesn't know what their future holds and is really anxious about it. And so I've started with our 16-year-old, again, our youngest, that if she's struggling with something that isn't true, and if she can recognize it's not true, I ask her, okay, and I got this imagery from John Acuff, a friend of mine and another author, is, okay, let's flip the coin over and let's think of 3 statements that are true. You know, what you're believing is not true. Let's flip the coin over and think about 3 statements that are true. And at least one of the statements needs to start with the word God or Jesus. So, you know, and so literally this was yesterday morning with my 16-year-old. She was believing something that wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true, but it was still really troubling to her. And so I sat next to her on our couch and said, okay, let's flip it over. Let's flip the coin over. 3 statements. And she struggled at first. So like I suggested one statement and she liked that. And then she came up with the last 2, including the one that started with Jesus. But I just think we as parents, we can help our kids replace lies they're believing, especially about their identity, belonging, and purpose, with truth. And I found it helpful to say, okay, one of the 3 statements, how about if it starts with Jesus or God? Because that way, you know, there's some solid faith integration too. So.
No, that's really, really good. I like that. And it's bringing out the positive, I guess, speaking truth.
Absolutely.
And all they're hearing is lies.
Yep.
Okay. And then for parents who have younger children who haven't reached the teenage years yet, what foundations would you encourage them to work on while their children are young?
Yeah. You know, I'd say talk about Jesus a lot. And then I would say something that I'm really glad we did is as the research was coming out, our Sticky Faith research was emerging, Dave and I really made a purpose of connecting with other families and sharing life with other families and other senior adults and other single people. And we really tried to create a team that was journeying together. And so I would say, you know, for you parents of younger kids, like you're exhausted. I totally get it. Parenting is not a solo sport. It's a team sport. So, you know, is there one other family, one other single parent, a senior adult who lives nearby or is part of your church who you could reach out to and say, boy, it would mean so much if you would invest in our kid. And I'll tell you, especially if you ask your kids, who are some adults you'd like to get to know? And then you go to those adults and say, hey, my daughter said that you're one of the adults she'd really like to get to know. I mean, that's compelling to an adult. So will you come to her soccer game next week? You know, and so I would say create the team when your kids are young. It just makes it easier and more organic. It's never too late, but it's easier if you start young in creating that web of relationships.
That's cool. And I guess you think about people that you trust and know well within that context as well.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. And that gives us as parents a fair amount of influence even over the adults, especially before our kids can drive. We have a lot more influence over the adults who are investing in them. So.
Well, thank you so much, Kara, for sharing your wisdom, for writing these books and researching so thoroughly into these areas just to help us as parents. I'm really grateful that you were talking to us today.
My pleasure and honor. Blessings.
Thank you.